This is the first time that I've ever had a tsunami instigate a pause in the proceedings.
Me too.
Frankly, I don't have a lot of experience with tsunamis. Do you?
I get to see when I'm coming back from the beach, sometimes there are certain streets that there's the most ridiculous sign. It's usually a block or so from the beach, and it's a sign that says tsunami evacuation route, and there's just an arrow pointing away from the ocean. Who is this sign for?
Well, hey there, friends. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Curiosity Plus Courage podcast. If this is your first time jumping in, welcome. My goal here is to illuminate, to widen perspectives, to unlock useful insights for those of us grinding away in the business of creativity. I've got a handful of older episodes you might want to check out after listening to this one. Conversations about writing novels, leading global creative teams, and composing music, among many endeavors. And if you're all caught up, if you're a loyal listener, thank you. I really appreciate your time and attention. I think you're going to appreciate today's conversation, which was interrupted by a tsunami. So I'm talking here with James Brown, sometimes referred to as not that James Brown. I first met James in St. Louis, Missouri at the agency TBWA Switzer Wolf back in the early 1990s. This was an outpost in the vast TBWA Chiat Day network, a good place to cut our teeth as copywriters. And years later, we got to collaborate again working on the VW business. And then, many years after that, James became my meditation teacher. So we're going to talk about all of the above, how James got into advertising, how Jeff Goodby suggested that he might focus in writing, and the journey into creative leadership, and then reaching for the quintessential brass ring. And then a pivotal moment, which is not the tsunami. James and I recorded this session back in December, and if you recall, there was a moment when San Francisco faced tsunami warnings, which forced us to cut our original session short. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice a change in wardrobe. Now, this is a conversation about what it means to be a creative person. We're going to talk about those early nudges which spark a career, how a creative person finds their way into advertising, how they flourish, as well as the business of creative briefing. James and I talk about the award show industrial complex, the addiction to certainty, and the necessity of stepping back to see yourself amidst the big picture. Here's my conversation with James Brown. What's the last song that you listened to that made an impact?
The last song that I listened to that made an impact is called Fix It by Lady Blackbird. And Lady Blackbird is a singer that is at the intersection, very fertile intersection of gospel, jazz, and R&B.
Mhm.
And grew up like a lot of people singing in the church and then sang outside the church. And the thing I like about it is I was listening to it and it had sort of a foundation that seemed to be very similar to the left hand on the piano of Bill Evans'
Mm.
phenomenal song "Peace, Peace."
Mm. Yeah.
And I listened to it and listened to it, and then I finally looked at the credits and I saw that Bill Evans was listed as in the writing credit. But then I'm like, "But that's not possible."
He's a
I
sample.
think
Yeah.
they just kind of liberally borrowed
Yeah.
that, so much so that they felt they needed to credit
Yeah.
him, which I thought was beautiful.
No,
And
their
it
lawyers felt they
Yeah.
needed to credit
And no,
his fake.
I think she's honestly, like,
Yeah.
but anyway, it's just such a great, and it made me remember that song and how much I liked that song.
Yeah.
Um, it was interesting because, she decided to put lyrics to it.
Mm. Yeah.
And she has a lovely voice. And so I kind of played that over and over and over again. But
It's
I
fun.
kind of like, that's one of the things I love about jazz.
Yeah.
I love the idea of standards, and
Mhm.
that many, many, many people can have their interpretation of them.
Mhm.
In
Right.
fact, back in Napster times, one of my favorite things to do was type in a song like Mac the Knife or something and quickly collect all the different versions of it.
Right.
And that's something you can do on Spotify as well, or on any
Right.
streaming service. But it
Yeah.
is interesting when you look at, like, you know, like songs like Pink Floyd's "Wish You Were Here," and then just see all the different people who've done versions of it,
Yeah.
um, and all
I'll
the
send
different.
you a link. The pianist Robert Glasper um, did an interview, and he's kind of talking about the roots of dozens of hip hop songs. And it's like, look, here's an Ahmad Jamal track.
Mhm.
And, Nas took these 6 notes, slowed them down, put a beat over it, and oh, that's that De La Soul track that we all know and love,
Yeah,
and he makes the point that jazz is the mother and father, the king and queen of hip hop, and
yeah,
you know, he said something like, "Ahmad Jamal kind of makes it easy,"
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's all those great like, there's that podcast Dissect
yes, Dissect is
and
fantastic.
other
Yeah,
similar things, and it's just wonderful that they can but there's so much in there.
right. So I know you. We first met in lovely St. Louis, Missouri, working for
On the basketball court.
on the basketball court, working with some amazing characters in an advertising agency. But
Uh-huh.
for the folks who are listening or watching, give me a brief summary of like your childhood. Like, where did you grow up, and how did those environments and forces ultimately propel you into advertising, where we met?
Yeah, so I my dad was in the military.
Hmm.
I was born in Paris, but
Oh,
there only long enough to just be able to say I was born in Paris, but
hmm,
didn't learn to speak French or anything like that.
right.
Uh, and then lived all over because my dad was in the military, so I lived in
Hmm.
Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, Tokyo, Japan, Belleville, Illinois, right across from St. Louis, where you and I met.
Hmm.
Central California, Los Angeles, and so always moved.
Mm.
In fact, it was when I met you, when I moved from Los Angeles to St. Louis, that I felt uprooted for the first time in my life.
Wow.
And it was in retrospect that I realized I had been rooted. And
Mm.
that's how I realized that Los Angeles is my home, even
Yeah.
though I don't live there now, but I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
hopefully moving back next summer. But,
Right.
it was just I just lived a rootless life, and so I didn't really even know, like, what it meant to have a place that felt like home until I
Right.
lost that feeling.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
And what were you interested in as a kid? I mean, I've
Well,
heard plenty of your stories, but like
yeah,
ultimately what got you into like you're a writer. So how did you discover that words were a thing you could do?
so when I was in 5th grade or maybe 3rd grade, I wrote there was an assignment in English class, a descriptive writing essay, and I wrote
Mm.
an essay. I wrote a little piece about a sailfish jumping out of the water and the light reflecting off its scales and the splashing and the
Mm.
forearms of the fisherman pulling, and the teacher read it aloud in class, and I remember feeling so proud,
Mm.
and I felt in that moment, "I'm gonna be a writer." And
Mm.
of course, what happened, though, is that then this impossible burden of everything that I ever wrote having to be great enough to be read aloud in class, rose up on the heels of that, and my entire life, I've I've written a lot of things, but I've never really felt like I've written something that I value, which is
Mhm.
why this project I'm currently doing to sort of publish this book of my essays coming up in the new year is
Right.
really meaningful to me
Yeah.
because the seed for that has been planted so long ago and never really came to fruition.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah,
Are my words good enough?
yeah. Will
Maybe.
I get an A on this?
Yeah.
Will
Well,
other people, will the teacher like, and so there's a
yeah.
lot there. I don't think I'm alone in that.
No, you and I both know. Like, go
Yeah,
read, The War of Art. Go read any of
yeah,
Lynchpin. All of the books that speak to that.
yeah,
That whole. But what about me?
yeah. But I've always liked writing. I've always
Yeah.
enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed words
Yeah.
and like
How'd you discover advertising
so
though?
advertising interesting. So myself, but my other than that initial unwatered and unblossomed sort of seed that was
Yeah.
planted very early. The other dominant sort of thread of my interest and where it seemed my life was going was I was gonna be a lawyer.
Mm.
Um,
I can
I
see that in you.
I grew up yeah, my wife's like, "Yeah, you would have been a good lawyer, but it wouldn't have been the best part of you that would have been good at it." So I grew up in a very contentious home, a lot of argument,
Yeah.
a lot of drama, a lot of television, and I remember one of the shows that I would watch when I was a little kid was Perry Mason.
Yes.
Loved how he would just eviscerate people on the witness stand, how he would cross-examine things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I've always been incisive, I've always been good with words, I've always had a little powerless kid's anger at the situation he found himself in that was just bristling and wanted to say the thing that I knew would get me in trouble, right?
Mhm.
And so that idea of that with your words and with your intellect, you could, um, bring someone down, right?
Mm.
Expose them for what they were. I
Yeah.
think, I was gonna be a lawyer, I was gonna be a litigator.
Yeah.
And And in high school, I got into debate, and I loved debate. I loved being able to talk. I could talk quickly and articulately. I loved cross-examination, and I was gonna be a lawyer.
Right.
And then I went to college and was on, like, a pre-law track, and then I worked at a law firm as a junior.
Mm.
Worked at a law firm in LA with my friend Roger Gray, who did end up becoming a lawyer, and and it was miserable. I mean, the people there were miserable. No
Mm.
one was enjoying their life. Everyone was stressed. Everyone
Yeah.
was it was like my family, but like occupying an entire floor of the Bank of America building in downtown Los Angeles. A lot
Right.
of arguing, a lot of backbiting, a lot of and so I was like, "Oh my God." Like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this at all. And I can't do this.
Mm.
This would be a disaster. And
So advertising, obviously,
and so then I talked to my had
because
a
there's none of
conversation.
that stuff in an agency.
Yeah. I exactly. I I had a conversation with my high school English teacher, who was also the
Mm.
debate coach, Mrs. Mydell, who was probably the most influential teacher in my life.
Right.
And she said and it's funny how just a little nudge like this can
Mhm.
be enough to put
Mhm.
someone on a 25, 30-year career path. She
Right.
said, "Well, my brother's in advertising, he likes it." And I'm like, "Okay." So I bought Adweek.
Mm.
Like, at this point, I was, a senior. I never graduated, but I was done with college.
Yeah.
And I bought Adweek. And
Mm.
I flipped open the back of Adweek. I started looking at the want ads, and I saw an ad for, a junior account executive.
Mm.
And I read the description. I'm like, "I could probably do that."
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
went and I interviewed at this small firm, J.R. Navarro and Associates in
Mm.
Westwood. And back then, this was before computers, this was before there
Right.
was still this idea of a position that used to be called copy contact,
Mm.
where you met with the client and you wrote the ads.
Mm.
And Mike fully embraced that.
Mm.
So though my title was junior account executive, I was also expected to write. I was also expected to then present what I wrote and work
Mhm.
with the art directors to, and doing
Right.
paste up and, looking at typography. And so I kind of did everything.
Mhm.
And I did that for 3 years and, and then, and then wanted to get a job. Actually, I ended up leaving in a huff
Mhm.
for kind of a
As one
one of
does.
those life intersects work
Yes.
scenarios that was the spur to get me out of a very constricted environment. And
Yeah.
when I went to a big agency, they were like, "What do you do?" I go, "I kinda do everything." They're like, "Well, you can't do that here."
Right. Yeah. Right.
And I said, "Well, my title's account person." They go, "Well, then you'll be an account person."
Yeah.
And then I did that for many years
Mm.
and became sort of director of account services at a mid-sized agency that
Yeah.
specialized in consumer electronics. But it was at that point that I started getting this idea that I think I'd rather write think
Yeah.
I'd rather make ads than just present someone else's ads.
Right.
And it was actually the creative director of that agency that was very encouraging of me because, I described my job as an account person as analogies on demand. Like
Mm.
clients would say something and I was expected to defend the work. And because I think I come from a place of really respecting and loving the creativity of advertising
Mhm.
or the cleverness, which we'll talk about later, um, I was pretty sort of dogged in my defense of the work and trying to find ways. Like I didn't really take no for an answer very easily.
Yeah.
And the client would say something like, well, we would be proposing a budget for all new photography. And they'd say, well, we just did a photo shoot with our last agency. Couldn't we just
Right.
use those photos?
Right.
And I said, yeah, you could, but it would be like building a tree with lumber. And the client was like, huh? I go, you could probably get it to be the right size and shape, but it just wouldn't be right.
Mhm.
And on the way back, the creative director said, "Have you ever thought about being a writer?" Like, and I'm like, "Well, I kinda have." And so I started working on that and with on my own, I put together kind of a crappy book and then ended up getting a crappy job at a crappy agency, but then kind of continued working and
Right.
way up from there.
And you pursue it. So, when you look back on, I mean, you and I have worked with all kinds of different designers and art directors and creative leaders,
Uh-huh.
and then you've been a creative leader. Um, what habits sort of define like an outstanding creative person? Like if you were to advise someone trying to, become a writer or advance, like what criteria or what character traits um set certain creative people apart?
Um, that's an interesting question because I think that there are lots of paths and lots of ways to be good, um,
Mhm.
or to be great. Uh But ultimately, you're gonna be at your best, and that doesn't mean the most successful, but at your best when you end up being whatever it is you are. So, I'm kind of a contrarian,
Mhm.
right? And so, I started by mimicking the best work that I saw,
Mhm.
but then I quickly realized that it was more rewarding for me to go in another direction. So when everyone was writing really short headlines, I would write longer headlines. When
Mhm.
everyone was trying to do like 3 lines of body copy because that's what fit the layout, I'm like, "What if we just had a one-word headline and 600 words of body copy?" What
Right.
if we didn't, like
Yeah.
and not to say that's more creative,
Right,
but
right.
was more me.
Yeah.
Other people, were, like, really good at and maybe even set the standard for the great short headline and snappy
Mhm.
visual, and so I think that ultimately being you start by being super curious, and you start
Right.
by seeing what resonates with you, and
Mhm.
then you start by seeing what's successful, and it's interesting because there's often a divergence between those things. In fact, I describe advertising as what I call the tyranny of the collective subjective.
Mhm.
Which is, did Goodby do it? Then it must be good. And so
Mhm.
then you start to see what the collective thinks of as good. And
Right,
then if you have some facility, you can kind of mimic that
right,
and then but ultimately you come down to what is good for me? Like what do I like?
right.
And
Yeah,
that's
and
the thing that like, yeah, is like I have to like it. Like I kind of care that the client likes it, but I have to like it.
yeah. I think about, like, the whole award show industrial complex
Yeah.
and the pool of judges, every year in terms of that point of, like, did Goodby do it? Like, the
Yeah.
sort of collective conscious about what equals good shifts and changes, and to try and capture that, to try
Yeah.
to appeal to that, and if that's your only kind of, like, marker ahead, you're gonna be dissatisfied probably most of the time. So, to your point, it's like, I write the words that I like.
The best thing Mrs. Mydell taught the very best thing she taught me, and the lesson that I found most applicable in almost every aspect of life,
Hmm.
is to, when you get an assignment or you are asked a question, to first, before diving in, take a step back
Mm.
and try to see and try to ask questions that have already presumably been answered. Like, why are we even doing this?
Right.
Is this the
Yeah.
way it has to be done? You know, and that's why whenever I would work with planners, and you and I kind of came in when planning kind of took over and then became like
Hmm.
almost this um
Religion.
smothering relentless force, right? Because and I would always try to work with planners and be like, leave big spaces in the brief.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? Don't
Yep.
be too specific. Leave big spaces because creativity often comes
Right.
um in the spaces that you leave. And so, for example, the very first actual good assignment I did as a writer was I was assigned to do a billboard that would be for the new LA Convention Center.
Mm.
And the brief was show a picture of the convention center and say something like announcing the new LA Convention Center or
Right.
something. And
Very
there was a
literal.
budget and there was a budget for photography of $10,000
Mm.
roughly. And
Yeah.
so I just, and again, maybe it's the contrarian me. I said, "Why would we put up a picture of a building in front of the building itself? Like, why
Yeah.
would we do that? What if we took the same money and instead of doing one billboard that would be up all year, we did 8 billboards that would rotate throughout the year and highlight some of the different conferences that are gonna be there?" And
Hmm.
so we came up with this idea, and it's funny, I was talking to Cameron Day, who you may know, and he
Mm.
was one of the people who looked at one of my very first books, and he still remembered this line, and one of the lines was said, "12,000 psychologists are coming to LA." And it said, "How do you feel about that?" And
Right.
it the new LA Convention Center.
Yeah.
And so we basically, for the same budget, created 8 different billboards. And so the space in which that idea could arise was created by me stepping back,
Hmm.
right? Because the brief was pretty specific.
Right.
Do this, here's the money, here's the, and we ended up doing something completely different
Right.
that the people who gave the assignment couldn't have imagined.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that's really creativity is usually comes in contrast or in contradiction with what's been asked or fills into spaces for the people who aren't sure. And so that's the thing, like either if you're working with creative people, um you have to leave space for creativity basically.
Hmm. Yeah.
And as creative you almost have to insist on it if it's not given to you. Yeah.
Yeah. There's definitely a challenge I've noticed in advising marketers, especially in my like in-house agency work. Um, there's a desire for a creative brief to be a mandate,
Yeah.
for it to be a very, um, I'm filling out a form to literally dictate specifically what will be in the work and to kind of box out creativity, to kind of box
Mhm.
out um, any chance that an original thought might suddenly appear. And that's my own kind of like, you
Yeah.
know, problem in terms of looking at it. But mechanically, a lot of organizations look at creativity in terms of, kind of a rote. They detach creativity is the execution of versus the conception of.
Mhm.
And the conception of piece, hopefully we've already figured that out, right? Someone's already dictated what the answer is. Now go execute versus we're going to give you time and space to think about what the idea could be. Whoa, that seems luxurious and scary and expensive
Yeah.
and I think a lot of business people to this day, um, will pay lip service to the idea of creativity, but they're honestly terrified of it.
Yeah, because they can't control it and they can't understand
Mm,
it. Because
yeah,
creativity is mysterious.
yeah,
It
yeah.
it's sort of like the difference between spirituality and religion.
Mhm.
Like, religion is rules and
Right.
follow these rules and do this and we'll tell you what's true. And
Right.
spirituality is finding out for yourself what's true.
Man. Yeah.
So spirituality is embraces the mystery, creativity embraces the mystery, and there's a lot of people who, for all kinds of reasons, are very uncomfortable with that uh,
Mhm.
because they don't know if it's going to be good.
Right. Yeah, it's an addiction to certainty, as you say, it's this notion of controlling controlling things that are frankly uncontrollable. So, there was a point where, I knew you as a creative director, as a writer, and then, "Hey, guess what? James is now, studying meditation," and I remember you coming to Minneapolis, you stayed in her house, and you kind of revealed this entirely new side of yourself and an entirely
Yeah.
new practice. And so talk a little bit about how you made that pivot and what motivated it.
What seems like a quick pivot actually takes years to unfold, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, because you don't just one day wake up and go, today I'm a creative director, tomorrow I'm going to be a meditation teacher, right? Um, and so I think what happened is that I moved along my life path, finding success,
Mhm.
um, being encouraged, looking ahead to what the next step, the next title might be.
Mhm.
And then I got this sort of idea from deep within, like maybe I'd rather do this. And that describes the process by which I made the first big pivot, which is to go from director of account services to junior copywriter,
Right.
right? Like that took a long time. And
Yeah.
it took being willing to let go of certainty and feel like you're actually going backwards for a while
Mm.
because I had to
Right.
take a 75% pay cut.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And so in many cases, to make a pivot like that, you have to be willing to give up a lot of what you've seemingly acquired.
Mhm.
Um, but it took a long time, and there was no certainty about it, right?
Right.
It
Right.
just the kind of in fact, the very funny story is that I was once interviewing at Goodby to be the management director on the Carl's Jr. account.
Mm.
And I met Andy Berlin, and I met Harold Sogard, and I met
Right.
Rich Silverstein. I didn't really meet Rich. I catch saw Rich and saw his office, and then, you know, and then my last meeting was gonna be with Jeff Goodby.
Yeah.
And Jeff brings me in. He's a very unassuming guy, wonderful, warm person,
Yeah.
but I wish I'd gotten to know more in my life. And he said, "Look, everyone seems to like you. You seem very well qualified for this job, but I have a question. It's kind of an odd question." He says, "You're Jim Brown account guy." He goes, "Right here on my desk, I have a junior copywriter book from James Brown with the same address. What's the deal there?" And I'm like, yeah, that's me." Um, he says, "Well, what do you want to do?"
Mm.
He says, "This is a pretty senior position, but I don't think we could give it to you if that's not what you want to do." I go, "Well, I think I'd really rather be a writer." He says,
Mhm.
"Well, that's what you should do then." I said, "Well, then hire me as a writer." He said, "No, you're not good enough yet." He said, "But keep working on it." So, yeah. But how you make the pivot from being a like a creative director to a meditation teacher, I think starts with starting to lose interest really in being a creative director in
Mhm.
ways that you're not necessarily willing to admit to yourself. It's
Mhm.
just this faint stirrings of like, this isn't what you're meant to be doing.
Mhm.
And And I started to feel those strings when I made a move and got what was on paper the best job of my own life,
Yeah.
right? I was creative director on this big account for a very hot new creative shop in San Francisco. I was the
Right.
32nd hire.
Right.
Um, and the agency was winning all these awards and
Right.
very, difficult to get into. And and yet I felt like, the way I described it to my wife, I said, "I feel like I'm on a cruise and everyone is partying and having
Right.
fun, and I feel like I have the one room down below decks that doesn't even have a porthole." Like
Mhm.
like, intellectually, I'm like, "This should be more fun. This should
Mhm.
be more rewarding. This should
Right.
be." And 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 it didn't work out, right? I ended up leaving after a year.
Right.
I said to myself, I'm never going to take another full-time job.
Mm,
I'm just going to freelance because I had been
mm,
comfortable freelancing many
right.
times in my life. And that in itself is a way of declaring some space.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
if we crowd our lives and our minds fully, then it doesn't leave space for whatever might be new to sprout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I said, I'm never going to take another full-time job.
Right.
And that was the deliberate act of, and I got an immediate test of that.
Mm,
Where 3 weeks later, I got a call from a headhunter about a job in, like, Des Moines, Iowa or something, and it was like, a B2B agency looking for a creative director, and,
yeah.
you and I both know the way to handle that call is like, "Wow, what an interesting opportunity," I have relatives in Iowa, but, what I found is sometimes the best way to sort something like this out is maybe a freelance project, maybe, a consulting thing for a few months and get the
Right.
feel for things, and you have no interest in taking that job.
Right.
But
Yep.
3 months of freelance work, not bad, right?
Yeah. Right.
And instead of playing that game, I said, "You know what? That's not something I'm interested in. I'm not interested in a full-time job, but if you
Right.
want, I can help you find someone that might be a good fit."
Right.
And I put down the phone and I'm like, "Okay, I didn't play that game. I really don't want a full-time job."
Mm,
Um, and it was into that space that I had left. One day, this idea popped up and said, "You should be a meditation teacher."
mm,
And I had been meditating for about 2.5 years.
mm,
Um, and I had met people who made it seem like, oh, like I'd never thought like anyone, I'd never met a meditation teacher in my life,
yeah.
that wasn't a Zen priest. And so I don't know, the idea popped in my head and I dismissed it completely. I was like, that's a
Mhm.
ridiculous idea. I told my wife and she goes, oh, that's funny. Because I was like the least spiritual person on the planet, apparently,
Yeah. Yeah.
according to a lot of people. But the idea kept being there. And so I finally just said, okay, what would this require?
Do you ever hear a voice inside your head? Do you ever wonder if the path you're on is the right one? I really appreciate James's candor around deciding to step back from advertising, to not take the bait and move to Iowa. He heard a different calling, and I have some familiarity with that experience. How about you? So our conversation continues. James isn't done with advertising, but he is asking himself important questions about the path he's been on, and we learn a lot from his example. We're going to talk about the heads up versus heads down approach to creativity, being open to the voices trying to get your attention, and we'll dive deep into the practice of meditation, the business of spirituality, and finally, James's fascinating take on the role of AI and technology in our search for spiritual fulfillment. We also spend time talking about the three forms of Vedic philosophy, which drive absolutely everything. And I'm talking about creativity, maintenance, and destruction. There's a lot to chew on here. So here's the second half of my conversation with James Brown. Help me understand kind of like where was the spark and kind of what were the steps that you took?
Spark is a good way of thinking about it
Mm,
because if a spark falls on dry tinder, it will start a fire. If it
yeah,
falls on damp moss, nothing happens, right? So,
right.
so the real story is that it looks like a pivot, right? It looks like a quick pirouette. Like I was the creative director of a hot creative shop in San Francisco, and then I became a meditation teacher.
Right.
But
That's the movie version.
yeah, but the real life version is more like a very large ship turning around,
Mm,
right? And
yeah.
that started with having the experience of having this great job, but it not being as rewarding to me and as fun for me as I thought it should be. Right, as I
Yeah.
described,
Yeah.
it felt like I was on a cruise ship and everyone was partying and having fun, and I was stuck in my room, and I had the only room without a porthole.
Yeah.
And
Is
so
it
when I yeah,
and I was gonna say, like, that happens, I think, a lot more than maybe, the hopes and dreams of Hollywood and all the movies would like you to
yeah,
believe,
yeah, it does.
that there's a lot of people who, you're the dog chasing the squirrel and you catch the squirrel.
Mhm.
and you've got the brass ring, and you realize the brass ring's kind of
Yeah.
heavy or uncomfortable or
Yeah, I didn't really
whatever.
want this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so part of it comes from being able to understand and admit to oneself that you're on the wrong path.
Yeah.
And then and that then some real implications to that, right?
Yeah.
So for me, the understanding wasn't that I was done with advertising. In fact, I'm
Mm,
still not done with advertising. I still
yeah.
enjoy thinking about that sort of stuff, and sometimes I work on fun freelance projects, and but
Right.
I was certainly done managing a department. I was certainly done having that level of responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I said that I would never take another full-time job.
Yeah.
And that's a way of clearing space. That's a way of saying,
Mhm.
despite this winnowing sort of appreciation for the path I'm on, despite having butted my head against this wall now twice, and we both know people who have continued to put themselves in a situation, it doesn't work out, and they find the next situation that's the same and it doesn't work out, and you're like, you're kind of hitting yourself against you're running into the same wall because we have this idea that no, we're supposed to be moving up the ladder. We can't go
Right.
back. And for a lot of
Right.
people, the idea of diverting to a new path seems like surrender, seems like going back, seems like losing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I realized like, oh, I'm just not going to do this anymore. I'm just going to freelance. I'm not going to take another full-time job. And that was a way of declaring some space. Open space is like that dry kindling, right? So that when
Right.
the idea came, when the spark came, which is that random idea from out of nowhere that
Right.
said you should be a meditation teacher, right? Like, it started to catch, right? It wasn't
Well, now,
immediately snuffed out.
when you heard that, was it a man's voice or a woman's voice? Was it
It was, in retrospect, it was just a thought articulated in words. Like, I don't necessarily think of it as like a voice, but that's the way we
yeah.
talk about it.
And you had been meditating,
For about
correct?
3 years, yeah. The great
Okay. And was well, let's back up even a little bit further. Like, what occurred for you to even notice and take on a meditation practice in the first place?
Oh, that's actually a really, talk about another path that was coming to a close that ran into a wall. So the thing that got me onto a meditation path is my life falling apart about a year or so after our son was born and all of the
Mm,
stress that comes from having a kid and all the pressures it can put on a relationship. And I had
yeah.
a job at the time that I was trying to hold on to. And I didn't handle the storm of that chaos very well.
Mhm.
I adapted to it in a way that I had maybe learned in the past to sort of find some validation.
Yep.
And it fell apart in a scene that was almost out of a soap opera,
Yeah. Yeah.
and is sort of in the storm of that chaos that I discovered that there was a different kind of way to meditate that I had, not heard of before. I decided to be a little curious about it. I went, I liked what I heard. I decided to learn, even though I was skeptical, and it worked great. I mean, my wife and I learned together. In fact, learning to meditate together was the start of us beginning to repair our relationship
Hmm.
because we could begin sharing an experience with each other again. And all relationships
Yeah.
that we
Yeah.
built and strengthened on the basis of shared experience. And so,
You had been meditating for 2 or 3 years, and at some point you decide I'm going to shift from, the larger responsibilities of managing in a big agency, et cetera, go back to freelance, gain some freedom and control.
uh
And at some point in that sort of, as you say,
yeah,
the
about
sort of the
3 months
dry
after that,
tinder, all of a sudden this
yeah,
notion pops into your head. You should be a
you should be a
meditation
meditation
teacher.
teacher. And I
Yeah.
will say that it seemed absurd at the time, both to me and my wife. I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a dumb idea." And I told my wife, I said, "Hey, I got this weird idea to be a meditation teacher." And she's like, "Oh, that's funny." But the idea kept coming, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then I just finally reached out to the first person who taught me and said, "Yeah, I've been getting these weird ideas about being a teacher." And he said, "Yeah, I've been waiting for your call. You're about 6 months late." And I was like, "Really?" But now, having been a teacher for a long time, I have seen in other people what
Mm.
he must have seen in me as far as like potential for that.
Isn't that
Uh,
a funny thing that occurs amongst humans where we see our friends, we see our family living a certain way,
mhm.
following a certain path, and we all kind of know that's not really the right path for that person, or
You know?
whatever. They're misaligned in some
Mm.
way, and then they find the alignment, a different relationship, a different work, a different approach to life, and we're all like, oh yeah, we knew that was. And as when you hear that from someone, I've been waiting for you, it's been you're six
Yeah.
months late. It's kind of like, how how did the rest of you know that about me?
Yeah, yeah.
Like I've had that happen, where it's
Yeah.
been like, wait, you knew?
It's very common, and again, it's very common. There's a great expression that says, "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are."
Yeah.
And what
Yep.
that means is that and the truth is that very few people can see themselves with the same sort of detached objectivity as others can
Yeah.
often see them.
Yeah, You
I
you
do think
can't.
that yeah,
I mean, we talk. There's a lesson when you're teaching people about voice acting and
yeah,
voiceovers and things like that, which is to recognize that you're never going to be able to hear yourself.
yeah.
Like in the moment when you're speaking, biologically, physiologically, as I'm talking, my ears are turned off. They
Mhm.
they are not. There's something about, like, you would essentially drive yourself nuts.
It's like, look how annoying it is when you're on a conversation and there's an echo.
Right. Yes.
You no one can have that conversation for very long. You have to say, "Hey, let's hang up and we'll try again."
So you heard the voice, you called your old teacher, and what's the for those of us who are maybe are
Yeah.
curious and on that precipice or considering, like, what's the path? How does that work? How do you become a meditation teacher?
There are lots of paths and there are
Yeah.
lots of ways to approach it. The way I looked at it is I took what I would think of as just the first tentative step, right? Like there were going to be 7 advanced knowledge courses I would have to complete, which were offered over weekends. They were weekend
Mhm.
workshops, and I
Yeah.
would have to drive down to LA. And I
And we should just pause for a second to frame it, to
yeah,
acknowledge that your path for meditation was through Vedic, VEDIC.
yeah,
Vid-
Vedic meditation. Yeah.
There are obviously other types of
Mm,
meditation, other
lots of them. Yeah.
schools, philosophies. You just picked the one that worked for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I found success with it, so it kind of makes sense that I mean, essentially, when the idea came, I was like, "Yeah, I think I would like to share this with other people." I mean, it's changed
Yeah,
my life. Maybe it could change other people's lives,
yeah,
and I will say it's been a very rewarding career. I mean, I won some awards in advertising, which felt great. I got
right,
bonuses for having done good work, which felt great. But I never got a letter from someone saying, "Hey, I watched your ad and it changed my life or it repaired my relationship with my wife." Like, so
right,
the kind of feedback I've gotten from teaching people to meditate has been truly rewarding.
right, right.
But how I became so I just took the first step, right? Like I could have saved some money if I signed up and bought the entire package of advanced knowledge courses. But I
Mhm.
was like, "I don't know. Let me just do the first one and see how it goes." So I did the first one and it went well. I did the second one, it went well. I did the third one, it went well, and I sort of proved myself as a student. And so my teacher's like, you don't have to drive down here anymore for the workshops. You can do solo study. I trust you. Uh,
Yeah.
and after about a year or so of that advanced knowledge, you'll call it,
Right.
and to some degree advanced practices, I then applied for teacher training, which was going to
Mm,
be this 4-month program in India.
mm,
Um, my teacher's teacher was hosting it. And even then I was like, "Ah, I don't know. They had a 1-month offering to become like a meditation guide to be able to help teachers, which was ridiculous because there were no teachers in San Francisco in my area. So there's gonna be no way I could help. But I was like, I think I could do that. I think I'll do the first month. And then, of course, I got on the program and I started seeing the other people on it. I started engaging with the content. And then I'm like, oh, I really want to do this. And I'd
yeah.
had a really good year freelancing the year before. So I could afford to take 4 months off. And
Right.
I had a very supportive wife who, even though we had a very rambunctious 4-year-old, was like, yeah, do this. Uh,
Yeah.
In
Wow.
fact, in the end, I think she believed in me more than I did, right? So
Huh.
I didn't leap onto the path. Again, the movie version, right? You leap into
Right.
it. I think you just every path is really just taken one step at a time. And
Yeah.
same way that my path as a advertising creative director had come to an end, right? I
Hmm.
think the reason I was able to find that next path was because instead of putting my head down and just using force of will to continue pushing along that path, as many do, I
Yeah.
looked up. And in that position of being looking up and being open, I was available to that idea.
Right.
I think that inner navigational beacon, that voice, that whatever we want to call it, is present in all people, but we get really good at drowning it out or ignoring it or talking ourselves out of it. And I
Yeah.
think
I what
one of the consequences of meditation practice where you turn inward every day is I think you get a little more attuned to that inner navigational beacon and you don't discount it quite so much. So yeah.
So that's an interesting space to kind of focus for a bit. This idea of kind of heads down, willful approach to creativity versus a heads up, um, you know, way in which you're being attuned or you're being open to inspiration. You're open to whatever, let's call it the cosmos has to
Yeah.
offer.
Mhm.
And one is a sort of a I would the heads up is kind of like recognizing in my mind that curiosity pays dividends
Mhm.
and that sometimes just having the willingness to be receptive to whatever might be there, um, and you don't know, like, as we all know with the muse may disappear on a vacation for a couple of months, and
Yeah.
then as the war of art dictates, and then all of a sudden the muse is back. Oh, you're back.
Yeah.
Versus the heads down type, and I think as a creative person, that sort of duality, I mean, I see it in terms of trying to coach. You'll meet someone at some point in their career, and you can just tell, oh, you've been on this like heads down rut for a while, and sometimes that works.
Mhm.
Sometimes in certain circumstances with the right people, the right constructs, that can really work.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not a long term. I don't know anyone who's made a career of that approach that hasn't also, crashed and burned, you know?
Mhm.
And what's your take on, because you've also taught now you've taught meditation and you've worked with all sorts of different kinds of
Yeah.
creative people. When you think about that sort of heads down, willful, only I, egocentric kind of like approach to creativity
Mhm.
versus it's taking a risk to kind of look up and allow. What do you think about all that?
There is obviously a a very understandable and instinctive clutching
Yeah.
to what we want to have happen, right?
Hmm.
So let's
Yeah.
just take it back in advertising. You go into a meeting and you have an idea that you know is good
Yeah.
and it doesn't get approved, right? And so the very understandable and typical reaction is to defend and to fight for and to push back against the criticism. And then when it becomes apparent that you're not going to win all those arguments, to say, well, maybe if we made this change and this change, but what
Hmm.
you're still trying to do is save that idea,
Yeah. Yep.
right? And in the process of saving it, you kill it. Right? And you create something that no one is proud of. It doesn't work, the client's not happy with it, and you're not happy with it.
Or you kill the relationship that provides permission for you to have
Yeah.
ideas, right?
Or
Yeah.
you kill the relationship.
Yeah.
And so that's actually the risky strategy. The more
Yeah.
the safer strategy is to go, "Oh, well, you know what? Rather than the safer strategy is to realize, like, there's always more ideas.
Yeah.
Great, we'll come back with something else." Right? We talked
Yeah.
about Goodby before. One of the things that made Goodby a great agency is they didn't try to get ideas approved knowing that the things required to get them approved would ruin them. They were like, "We'll come back."
Yeah.
And sometimes the clients would be like, "No, no, 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 you really like this, right?" They're like, "Yeah, we love it." Well, if we just make this one change, well, I mean, and they're like, "No, no, no, we'll come back. We'll come up with something else."
Yeah.
And in that situation, the clients are like, "Oh, no, no, no. Okay, well, fine. If it's that important, you can do it." And so
Well,
so I think it comes from that knowing that ultimately creativity is something that is flowing through you, right?
yes.
And so, like the water doesn't belong to the hose,
Right.
you know?
Well,
And so
you're reminding me a little bit of some of the writing of Robert Grudin and some of, Seth Godin and
Mhm.
even like Anthony DeMello, and the sort of the notion that, yeah, you've never were in control,
Mhm.
you know, and to recognize that ideas are all around us. They will always be there. The
Yeah.
music is always playing. And sure, in this instance, it just so happens that the way that you configured and presented this particular idea to these people in this point in time isn't resonating with them.
Yeah.
Um, and to have the confidence to realize, no matter, there are other ones. And sometimes that demonstrating that level of confidence that like I will go find another equally wonderful idea
Yeah.
sometimes causes clients to be like, you can do that? Well, I mean, then we'll produce this one.
And also that doesn't mean you have to discount like, one of the most famous ads of all time is Apple's 1984 commercial. Yeah, which was killed like 4 or 5 times, and AMC kept bringing it back.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't keep bringing it back without also having something else they believed in. They said, "Great, I know you really like this, and we're glad, but we would like you to consider again this because we do honestly still think has merit." And they got so at one point, they were said, "If you ever bring that back again, we will fire you." And they were like, "Look, I know you said that you'd fire us, but" and then finally it got approved.
Filmed and shot, and 3 days before the Super Bowl, they were still trying to sell off the media, right?
They would never have been able to finally sell it if every time they came back, they said, "You know what? We haven't come up with anything good enough. This is what you need to buy." They were like,
Right.
"Oh, hey, we really like this too. This is great. Actually, this would be great, and but we'd
Mm-hmm.
also like you to consider." So
You go to India, and I seem to recall that point in time. I remember you at one point telling some of us like, "Hey, I'm going to India," and we're all like, I'm sorry, what?"
yeah.
um, and and you come back, and I remember you came to Minneapolis and shared with us a bunch of us, your story, and that you were now teaching meditation. And I'm curious about, from an entrepreneur's perspective,
Uh-huh.
from a kind of a business operator, like now you're in business as a meditation teacher versus you were also in business as an advertising freelancer. And
Uh-huh.
where do those sorts of things overlap, and where do they differ from each other? Like, how help us understand what is the business model, if you will, or how does it one be an entrepreneurial meditation teacher?
To start with, I don't really think of myself as an entrepreneur, as certainly not a successful entrepreneur. And I don't think I brought an entrepreneurial mindset to this teaching business because what entrepreneurs are taught is like you have an idea, you execute, you build it up, and then your goal is to sell it, and then you'll do another one. Right?
Yeah.
That's the common model. Um, what I realized after a number of years of sort of teaching and is that in a way, my career in advertising did not prepare me to be an entrepreneur. Uh,
Mm,
because what my role was, whether I was on staff or as a freelancer, and it was probably more this way as a freelancer, is I would wait to be given an assignment.
mm.
And then once given an assignment, I would be shepherded along that path by project managers and other people who would be responsible for telling me what to do,
Right.
and when the deadlines were due, and so I could procrastinate, but I knew the limit, and I would do my best to crush it on that project, and to the
Right.
extent that I could do that and be pleasant to work with, I would probably get more work.
Right. Yeah.
And so when you become an entrepreneur, when you go into business for yourself, You're the one giving yourself the assignments. You're the one keeping you on track. You're the one, and I honestly don't think I'm very good at that. Um, I've also been very leery of using advertising to promote my business, which is ironic. And what I've realized is that I'm an ad person that doesn't really like ads, right?
I
Like
think
I
I
have
think
a
there are quite a few of us out there.
well, there are like I have a not I have an ad-free YouTube subscription. I have an ad-free Spotify subscription. Like I don't want to hear them. I don't
Yeah.
want to see them. I don't want them interrupting me.
Do you
Um,
remember do you remember Jelly Helm?
yeah,
Worked at Wyden, kind of like the quintessential like young star, great portfolio, the Martin Agency Wyden did all this great work. And he wrote a manifesto like after about 10 years at Wyden, kind of like basically saying like I don't want to be in advertising anymore.
one of the things I found most interesting when I made the transition, because of course, when I first started teaching, I taught a lot of ad people
Yeah, right.
because I think it was at your agency, Hello Viking, that I gave a talk. At
Yeah,
Carol Anderson, like a bunch
yeah,
of people came, ad
yeah,
people, and I was in my element, and I could present the teaching in a way that felt authentic and genuine to me, like without a
yeah,
lot of overtly spiritual stuff in it. And so I still have a lot of love for ad people. I actually do have a lot of love for the industry, and I still like the thinking and the problem solving. Um,
right.
I just but there were a number of people who I was stunned by this, and this is an example of keeping your head down and plodding along the same path, who said, "Hey, congratulations, man, on finding an exit strategy because, the first day you get into this business is the day you start thinking about getting out." And I thought, "Oh my god, how sad for you."
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah.
never felt that way, right?
Hmm.
Like, I didn't leave advertising because I was burnt out.
Yeah,
I was sort of running out of steam along a certain path, but I still and then I didn't this idea to become a meditation teacher, that wasn't my idea. Like, I didn't
yeah.
strategize that. Like, it
Right.
kind of worked out because, as we know, advertising, it tends to be a younger person's business, and no one says, "Hey, my meditation teacher is too old." Like, it's too many gray hairs. I've kind of thankfully switched onto a career path that I'm not gonna age out of.
There's
Um,
the money. There's the money quote. No one ever says my meditation teacher's too old.
yeah, exactly.
It's
In fact,
perfect.
my son tells me I should grow a longer beard because he says you'll look
Right.
wiser and make more money. I very much like Seth Gunn's approach, which
Mhm.
is that, look, advertising is just part of marketing. Like,
Right.
I don't think of myself as an advertising person anymore, but I do think of myself as a marketing person. When I was an ad person, I never really liked the idea that advertising was lying, right? Like,
Mm.
I forget who said it. Good advertising is the truth well told.
Right.
Even as a in fact, one of the kind of things that's interesting that I discovered, and maybe from my unique perspective of having come through the branding advertising world, is that when I was a creative director and when I was a copywriter, was an account person, my job was to tout my clients' supremacy in the world of competing brands, right?
Right.
On the unique selling proposition, I'd find the
Yeah.
executional, and I'd say, "This car, inkjet printer, whatever, is better than the competition." When I became a meditation teacher, I discovered, kind of with surprise, that the same kind of brand one-upsmanship exists in the spiritual world. Our guru's lineage is more pure. Our bliss is deeper and faster. I kind of parroted some of that stuff for a while I
Yeah.
was still at
Yeah.
that
You were
stage of being a teacher. But at some point I realized, like, look, these are just different flavors of ice cream, right?
right.
I mean, different things appeal to different people at different times in different ways. And that is
Mhm.
why there are a lot of different meditation practices, spiritual paths, steps you can
Right.
take, breath, right? And in the same way that you wouldn't want an ice cream parlor with only one or two flavors, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't want a world in which there were only one or two spiritual doctrines or spiritual
Mhm.
paths. But in the same way that I'm not gonna stand in an ice cream parlor and berate people who order pralines and cream because
Right.
clearly Rocky Road is the best,
Right.
which it is. Um, I'm not gonna stand there and say that my meditation technique, the way I teach is the best,
Yeah.
right? It's just it's anathema to me.
And it's amusing to hear you say that, even in the realm of spirituality and the training around spirituality, of all the types of advertising that could be embraced, the competitive one is the one that gets embraced by some people.
I think it comes down to respect. Respect for the person who's driving past your billboard, respect for the person who's on your website, respect for the person who's reading your email, respect for like you have the book of gossage right there. The thing that I think he had in spades was a genuine respect for the reader, right?
Yes.
So he might do a funny campaign about Fina gas stations touting pink air as their additive,
Right. Right.
to make fun of the fact that these other companies like Chevron and Mobil have additives in their gas, right?
Right.
So he's nodding to that competitive landscape, but in a way that assures you that he's not talking down to you, right?
Yeah.
In a facetious way, not a sarcastic way. Like we talked about, it's very common in the spiritual practice, the selling of spiritual practices, you know, and I'm sure you've seen this because it's not just that, it's coaching programs, it's all kinds of things
Right.
where someone will lay out their product and then it'll, let's say, cost $400 or
Mhm.
599. And
Yeah.
then there will be a part where they say, but it's the equivalent of, this many sessions and this much this. And so it's a $4,388 value for only 499.
Right.
I am never going to do that. Like,
Yeah.
it's effective. Like, there are a lot of things that are effective
Yeah.
that I still, out of respect for myself and the audience, can't do. I just can't.
It's also the application of models or different types of frameworks that at the end of the day are kind of incompatible, like pricing value in the context of spirituality.
Yeah, you're not gonna haggle your way to enlightenment.
Kind of shifting gears a little bit. So you and I are fortunate, we're all fortunate to be living in an era of human history that is moving really, really quickly. Like if you think about human beings over the last millennia, right? Really only in the last 200 years have we all come to kind of commoditize running water, electricity, roofs over our heads, medicine, things like Zoom calls. And and especially in the last 30 years, the technological change has been like at a wicked pace.
Mhm.
Ever since, the internet arrives and then broadband and then mobile and social and now AI, like help compare and contrast, like how have you looked at the pace of technological change as in your former hat of, advertising and marketing and like communication and storytelling, but also as a meditation teacher, like where do you see the pace of change from those two perspectives?
There is a tendency to try to say that certain technological innovations are, like, earth-shattering, groundbreaking, paradigm changing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And I think that almost universally, that's not true, right? That I think that you can really understand these things as being part of a continuum. And so, what I think is interesting is that no matter how much technology changes, there are still fundamental underlying human experiences that are unchanging. We live in a technological age, but we've always lived in a technological age, right? Bronze Age was a technological age, right? And so AI, of course, seems like this massive new thing. And you're like, if you take a step back, don't see things as they are, we see things as we are.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not necessarily what AI is, not that it might not do that because people created it and are at this point sort of programming it and setting it off on its course. But the way I tend to think about it is that, well, who said that human beings are the endpoint of the evolution of consciousness? I mean, it didn't start with us, right? And so why do we naively assume that we're going to be the endpoint of it? I don't think that AI is going to be the death of humanity.
Mm.
Um, and the fear with which it's necessarily it almost seems reflexively considered is, I think, more of a reflection of our psychological state.
In my consulting practice around AI, the vast majority of fear and hesitation appears to be rooted in the movies, comic books, and content that the audience consumed as children. You
Hmm.
know, that
Yeah.
we were trained, and it was really great storytelling. Like the ultimate villain is this kind of like non-human, yet sentient, yet intelligent entity that comes to crush us. I wanted to focus it a little bit, given, you know, what you do as a meditation teacher. Obviously the technology is coming into all spaces. I think,
Yeah.
Ben Thompson had a great quote about, like, we thought that AI would first come for like the long haul trucking jobs and the warehouse jobs, and the definitely not writing poetry, definitely
Yeah.
not painting and making images, and yet here we are. I'm curious, you learned, and I remember
Hmm.
you explaining that, meditation goes back thousands of years, and there's a
Yeah.
pedagogy that goes back thousands of years. And now there's a technological component to it. Is that incongruous? Is it supportive? Is
Not
it
at
the
all.
natural evolution of, like,
I don't think, yeah, I don't think it's incongruous at all. I mean, like a lot of people come, and mostly these are guys, will say, "Hey, I'm here to learn about meditation because science is proving it works." And I'm
Mm.
like, "Welcome, come in." However, you should know that it worked thousands of years before science could prove it, right? But now we live in an age which I call the Church of Science, where a lot of people will identify as, "I'm a science-based guy," but they don't really even know what science is, right? What they really are is a technology-based person, and they really worship at the altar of engineering,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Engineering is applied science, but pure science is hard to differentiate from mysticism because
Right.
scientists are at the very edge of knowledge, and they love being in wonder and awe and doubt and mystery,
Hmm.
right? They're not like hard-boiled certainty, that's not science. Science, that's
Yeah.
engineering, that's standards and practices and, circuits, but that's not science. So a lot of
So
people are coming because science is saying it works. But
does
go ahead.
AI technology like have a place in helping people meditate?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, we talked about meditation apps. I think meditation apps are a great way to start. They open the door for a lot of people. In my experience, I don't think the door they open leads very far, but it gets a lot of people to start. And
Right.
so the question then becomes, where do you go after that? Right? Like 80% of people who've taken a course with me have basically come saying, "Hey, I was using Headspace for a while, but," or "I was using a Calm app for a while, but," meaning they've kind of run aground, you know?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
the business model of an app is to tie you to the app,
Right.
right? If meditation is gonna be a practice of liberation, then being tied to your phone probably is only a certain point along that path.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
and when you start to look at how apps and things, there's the big new thing is gamification.
Well, gamification's been in the digital space for decades, but
Yeah,
it's all sort of showing up now in the
yeah,
environment that you're talking about.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and a great example of this, it's pretty funny, is because there was a very popular meditation app that allowed people to have a consecutive days streak, and that app had a massive glitch, or not even a massive glitch, had a glitch which reset everyone's consecutive day streak to zero.
Oh no.
And the firestorm of protest from enraged meditators, if you can imagine such a thing, like clamoring that they wanted their streak reporting back. And I was like, okay, so maybe this shows the limitations of gamification along a spiritual path, because one way to approach that discovery is pitchforks clamoring for the head of the engineering department and who led, and the others to go, "Oh my god, how funny that I think the system telling me how many days I've meditated is meaningful."
Yeah.
Like,
I
I
think
meditated. I know I've meditated for that many days.
right.
Why do I care that the system acknowledges it?
Yeah. I like the band name Enraged Meditators.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's a pretty good band name.
Yeah, I think it's all on the path. I think it's tremendously exciting.
But let's extend this even a little bit further. So when I think about Vedic meditation and finding that space where you're in it, and did it last for a few seconds or a couple of hours, or who knows? Where, it's when you come out of it that you realize I was in it.
In retrospect, you
In
realize it. Yeah.
retrospect, yeah. Do you ultimately think that like machines might develop a consciousness? This whole AGI thing,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm
I
looking
that's
at it through your expertise. Like, I don't know, do you think it's possible?
Someone once said, life can only be lived as a continuous experience, but it can only be talked about by breaking it up and understood by breaking it up.
Yeah.
And so, we come back to that very rich tension between the desire to know and the
Mhm.
absolute inability of knowing,
Yeah.
right? Um, that is irreconcilable. And
Yeah.
that is the tension that I think animates experience, animates life. And so, you know,
Yeah.
when we talk about technology, like what you are sitting in front of used to be cutting edge technology,
Yeah.
written language, publishing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so all of the spiritual books that have ever been written, all of them have taken people to a place at which they had to let go of the words and concepts to have the experience those things were pointing towards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so I don't see how an app or biofeedback or any of the promising, enriching, engaging, interesting technologies that are gonna do for human spiritual evolution what books used to do
Right.
or what spoken language used to do, right?
Right.
They're all gonna take you to a point at which whatever is beyond that point is vague, mysterious, awesome, right? Unspeakable. In fact, one of my
Yeah.
pet peeves, I'm a word guy, right? And it kind of drives me crazy that there's a word for not being able to put something in words, like ineffable. Like that word shouldn't exist, right? It should be like Prince, like just a symbol.
Yeah.
There should be a symbol for something you can't put into words,
Yeah.
right? It seems cheating that there's a word for it, but that's who we are. We like to talk and talk and talk.
Getting to a bit of a conclusion here, what advice do you have for people who realize I'm hearing that voice or I'm hearing a voice? How do you go about hearing it and taking advantage of it and finding peace with that?
So, from the Vedic perspective, right, is not a dualist philosophy. There's not good and evil. There are three forces that
Mm.
together sort of shape, manage, allow for the flow of experience. And
Mhm.
those three forces are creation, maintenance, and destruction.
Ah, the three spirits, the three
Yeah.
philosophies.
And
Yes.
so creation is meant and they're meant to sort of be sequenced in that order.
Yeah.
Creation is that which is responsible for new things being brought into the world, new genetic mutations, new ideas, new books, new plays, new relationships, new life, new, right? Maintenance is that administrative function that acknowledges and identifies that which is relevant for the current conditions and maintains it. So if you're in a relationship with someone and you have a big fight, right? And you might storm out of the house. There is some function that pulls you back together, right?
Mhm.
Let's work it out.
That
Destruction.
helps you
Yeah.
scale or
Yeah.
sustain, and yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so destruction is that necessary, helpful, beneficial force that removes things that are irrelevant, right? And the
Yeah.
best example of how quickly that can turn is when a baby is born, right? A baby is born in active creation. There's the
Yeah.
umbilicus, which maintains the body's sort of metabolism. It's the connection with the mother. And as soon as the baby is born, that thing that held the mother and baby together needs to
Yeah.
be severed and removed.
Yeah, the umbilical
Otherwise,
cord, yeah.
yeah, the umbilical cord, right? Otherwise, it's going to hurt. And so we live in a society that puts maintenance first.
Right.
You're told to not get another job until you know what your next job is gonna be. We are
Right.
told, to, the way a lot of people break up is by sandbagging it and paying less attention and making the other person break up with them,
Yeah.
right? And so we're told to maintain, to hold on to whatever we have. And because we put maintenance first, well, then destruction is next, right? In sequence. And that's why you get fired. That's why you get drunk on the way home from a fight with your girl. Nature will shove you off of an irrelevant path. And then that's why people say the worst thing that ever happened to me is the best thing that ever happened to me, right? Because destruction cleared away the irrelevancy that allowed something new to happen. But it doesn't have to be that dramatic, right?
Yeah. I
If
mean, I think your point that we put maintenance first, um, rhymes with the idea that we are addicted to certainty.
Yeah,
You know, we
one thing the universe will never deliver.
right. But organizations of all shapes and sizes and types, corporations, groups, whatever. Boy, if we can just hold on to certainty over and over and over, like, as you say, and put maintenance first,
Yeah.
that to kind of worship the status quo, that's the life raft that like so many people spend their entire lives clinging to,
Mhm.
because to your point, the fear of the word destruction and the idea that what will happen,
Yeah.
well, what will happen is creativity is going to show up.
And again, it's not to say that you need to constantly throw everything away, right? But it
Correct.
does have like maintenance does have a role. It's like back to what we were talking about creativity, like when you go in with an idea. If you cling too tightly to the idea that's being rejected, you're going to damage the relationship and then you'll damage your own relationship with your creativity because what it means is that you don't know if you can come up with another good idea. The reason
Right.
you're told so tightly is you don't know if you're going to come up with a better idea. This is
Right.
the best idea I've ever had.
You're locked in a fearful embrace with certainty and maintenance. Yeah.
How do you know? And so that's as a dynamic that explains a lot of what I see in the world, both in terms of personal relationships, business, holding on too tightly.
I can't imagine a better place to kind of like come to a conclusion here with our conversation. Dude, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, James. If it's not obvious, I'm a big fan of James's approach to living. He's taught me a lot, and he's a remarkable friend. I hope you spend some time thinking about those three forces and the endless cycle of creativity, maintenance, and destruction. How do they play out in your life, your work, your community? Well, if it isn't clear, James is a fabulous writer, which is another way of saying, of course, he's got a weekly newsletter you can subscribe to. I'll share links in the show notes for this episode. Good news, James is almost finished with his first book. I had the pleasure of reading it, and it is fabulous. So if you're listening to this in the future, you might want to look up James's website and find the book, which is scheduled to make its appearance in the latter half of 2025. Last but not least, if meditation intrigues you, James offers several ways to learn more. He's got the newsletter, he's got online coursework, Zoom classes, and in person sessions. Again, more links in the show notes. And thanks for listening. One thing you might notice about this podcast and my Substack newsletter is that I'm not asking for money. The newsletter and these conversations are all free to you. So if you found this valuable, found it engaging, maybe even useful, please spread the word. Share a link with just one other person. That's what matters most. And I'll keep shipping the work so you've got more to enjoy. That's it. Thanks for coming along.